So now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker of the night, Albert Koehl, and the company he's working for is Toronto Community Bikeway Coalition. And today's topic, he's going to be talking about Toronto Bikeway Report Card, an awkward discussion with City Hall officials. The Toronto Community Bikeways Coalition is a community-based campaign group advocating for 100 kilometers of bikeways to mirror the busiest TTC subway and bus routes. It was initially formed by a group of volunteers who believe Torontonians require safe alternative transportation options, particularly during the unprecedented time as our society grapples with the COVID-19 pandemic. So Albert, thank you for coming here, and I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, thanks very much, Artem. I'll share my screen and, okay, there we go. Try it now, okay. And, okay, can you see that now?
Nope, not yet.
Not yet, okay. Try that.
It doesn't look like you're sharing yet. If you can try again, please.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay. How's that?
Yep, if you can just put in present mode.
Okay,
Perfect.
Great. Okay, great. Can you see that? That's fine, and you can hear me okay? So I'll get started. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak. I, in fact, taught a natural resources management or natural resources course at law course at York University for 10 years. So I'm very familiar with the surroundings of York University. And I should say, as we waited for 10 years for that subway, and then when it was in place, the university decided to hire a full-time law professor to teach our course. So the second reason I mentioned natural resources law is because, of course, land is a significant and important natural resource. And one of the reasons it's been so hard to get cycling infrastructure in Toronto is because it is a fight about space, and it pits people who are struggling to get more space, and that's people who are on bikes or walking or taking transit, versus motorists. And of course, we know that motorists have been given the priority in our city for many, many years. And that's one of the reasons it's been so hard. I am a volunteer with this group called Toronto Community Bikeways Coalition. We did start at the beginning of the pandemic, and we said to ourselves, we're all volunteers. We said to ourselves, how can we help as cycling advocates? We know at that time, the mayor and others were simply saying, stay home. That was the advice, stay home. And of course, that seemed to go counter to advice we'd gotten for many, many years to get out, move around, exercise, and so on. And secondly, of course, that answer or that advice to stay home didn't work for essential workers and many other people who needed to go out shop. So what we did is we organized, got together, and we reached out to 120 community groups that signed a letter calling for 100 kilometers of bike lanes to be installed on an urgent basis to mirror transit lines. And that was our contribution to that. And then we, with other community groups, and there was a big push by a wide variety of community groups to get more space. It was really about space, more space for walking, more space for queuing at grocery stores or at liquor stores or wherever people were going, more space to ride a bike. All of these things required more space, and it meant taking space from motorists who were traditionally advantaged and prioritized in terms of how we divided, allocated space. So it's really very much about space and how that space is allocated. So I'm going to talk about this report card because our group, now that we're sort of 2 years almost into the pandemic, we're shifting a bit more into accountability in terms of cycling infrastructure, in terms of bike lanes, in terms of finances. And of course, it means accountability as well in terms of the environment, in terms of climate change, meeting those climate objectives and meeting also the road safety objectives set out in city policies. And then I'll get to the report card after I do this. Just a bit of a short history, because understanding how we got here, where we are today, I think will help you understand why it's taken so long to get here and what steps we might take to move forward. So I'll go through all of these slides very quickly in terms of starting 50 years ago, and it is virtually exactly 50 years ago that we had a bicycle boom, and that's what it was called in 1971, and then taking us to the, I suppose some people have called it a bicycle boom again in 2020, 50 years later. So in 1971, as I say, that was the bicycle boom, but the issue at that time, and you'll see a corollary to the issue that we faced at the beginning of the pandemic, is so many people want to ride bikes, so many people are riding bikes, but where do you ride a bike? Where are the safe places to ride bikes? And the response at that time, at the metro level, you may know, of course, that at the time, Toronto, what's now called Toronto, was divided into various regions: Scarborough, North York, Etobicoke, East York, and the Old City. So Metro, which had authority over arterial roads, and of course, arterial roads are very important to cyclists because there's always this idea that that cyclists are just out there riding around. They're not going anywhere. They're just having a good time. So we shouldn't really allocate any arterial road space to them because the important people are in cars and they're going places. But of course, we know as cyclists, we're usually on the arterial roads because we're going to the very same places. We're going to school, we're going to work, we're going to shop, we're doing all of these exactly the same things as motorists, and that's why we're on the same roads. But in Metro, they had this idea, well, let's get the cyclists out of the way of the motorists and put them on trails. And the Metro had this elaborate plan for like 400 kilometers of trails, and they were going to have kiosks and washrooms and lighting and all of these different things. And they were going to build 400 kilometers. And that was, and the motivation, the incentive was to get those cyclists off our roads and put them somewhere else. And that somewhere else is trails. And despite having that incentive, they only built something like 80 kilometers of trails. And then they threw in the towel and said, well, the rest are really too difficult. And we'll just leave it at that. So Toronto took the old city of Toronto took a different approach. And they said, well, cyclists belong on the roads. That's where cyclists should be. That's where they want to be. They're going places. Let's give them space on the roads. Well, they actually approved a lot of bike lanes in 1976, but they only built one of them, and that was on a street called Poplar Plains. It was less than a kilometer. It went straight uphill and one way. That's all they actually achieved in the 70s. And instead of putting in bike lanes, they had this bright idea, let's put in wider curb lanes instead, because at the time, from the US, there was a lot of this, sorry, this is back, cycle goes full circle. You'll see here that this was in 1969 when the bicycle boom was approaching because it started on the US West Coast. But of course, it was already happening here in Toronto, but the boom took a few more years, 1971. But in any case, so I was just saying, so they had this idea of the wider curb lanes. And at that time, a very influential person in this on this sort of issue was a fellow named John Forrester. He recently died. He was in his 90s. So he had this idea, well, we shouldn't really treat cyclists as any different from other vehicles. We should treat them as vehicles, and we should have them riding within the, and you'll see this picture on the left, we should have them riding with traffic in the motor traffic stream. And that's the way to do it instead of giving them infrastructure, because infrastructure, once you get to the intersection, gives people the wrong false sense of security, and they had various other reasons. And it had a real macho tone to it, because they would say, they would say things, or this fellow Forrester would say, don't give in to this cyclist inferiority complex. You are equal to motorists. And of course, it was all very great in theory, but the truth was, and this took till the end of the 90s in Toronto to realize, the truth was that, end of the 80s, the truth was that most people really weren't particularly attracted to the idea of what this fellow is doing here, riding with motor traffic. That wasn't very appealing. by the end of the, and I should say in Toronto, the City Cycling Committee, which was a volunteer organization of resident cyclists, there were advocates, they agreed generally, and the others were silenced, that the way to go was integrating cyclists with motor traffic. Of course, the shortcoming of all of this, as I say, it was nice in theory, but most people would say, I'm not cycling like this guy you see on the left. So in the 1990s, the old city of Toronto, they actually said, now we're going to start building bike lanes. And in Montreal, they had done this already. In Montreal, they were more influenced by what was happening in Europe. In Canada or in Toronto, they were more influenced by what was happening in the US. And of course, this vehicular cycling was very appealing to a lot of traffic planners because they said, well, you know, these people who are demanding space will say, oh, you can ride on the road, which was a nice solution for people other than cyclists, or the majority of people who wanted to cycle. But in the old city, we got bike lanes on the Bloor Viaduct. This was a place that got essentially the first bike lane on an arterial road. And what made that really interesting, of course, is that Bloor Street was an arterial road. So even though Toronto had this philosophy of let's start putting cyclists on roads and building bike lanes, Metro agreed to put a bike lane on the viaduct. And the result was the same result we hear all the time today. As soon as you build a bike lane, then you'll get more cyclists, more people cycling. But the city of Toronto also put bike lanes on College Street, Gerrard Bay, Davenport, Harvard, St. George. And at the same time, Metro, as you know, which had control over arterial roads, they decided, let's move on from this policy. We're not going to put cyclists on trails, but also they didn't build bike lanes, with a few exceptions. Here's one that I was mentioning earlier. This is on Steeles, beautiful farmland. You'll probably never see a cyclist here, but they decided to put a bike lane there. The speed limit there is about 60. The bike lane's not protected, but fortunately, there's no cyclists there. So, and there could be some, you know, heading out of town, but it's not a place you're likely to be cycling unless you're heading from one farm to the other. So then there was amalgamation in 1998. This is a more recent document, but you'll see sort of how it brought different parts of the city together, parts of the city that had different levels of walking, cycling, and transit, and car use. In the old city of Toronto, even then, the numbers were very strongly in favor of people walking, cycling, and taking transit. This particular document's from 2011. You'll see that the majority of people in Etobicoke, North York, and Scarborough do drive. However, there are strong proportions of people who take transit, walk, and cycle. And that strong percentage of people often doesn't get very much attention. So let me, so then Toronto did, when it amalgamated, it put together this beautiful bike plan. They said, we're gonna have 1,000 kilometers of bikeways, including 460 new kilometers of bike lanes. At the time, there were only about 40 kilometers in place. Unfortunately, there's a bike plan which got a lot of fanfare, had virtually no staff, no funding, no political will, and ultimately there was no action. Whether you were in the suburbs or in the downtown, there was no action. In total, after 10 years, about 84 kilometers was installed. And you'll know then, of course, once Mayor Ford, that he's notorious, you know, is remembered for this, for taking out bike lanes, this one here on Jarvis, and sort of a, you know, a fitting end in a way to a very failed bike plan. This fellow here, I think it's Michael Polanyi, he's blocking this vehicle that's coming, this big truck that's going to erase the bike lane on Jarvis. But I shouldn't say, you know, Mayor Ford is remembered for what he did or didn't do about cycling, but this was also something that had gone on for quite a number of years throughout the bike plan. So he was perhaps the most notable of the politicians who had failed city cyclists, but he certainly wasn't the only one. So we got a new bike plan in 2016, promised 34 kilometers of bike lanes per year. At the time, there were about 130 kilometers in place. Now compare that to Montreal, that is a smaller city, but it had 260 kilometers of bike lanes in place at the time. We got another bike plan in 2019, and that was essentially, once they had realized this 2016 bike plan was failing, they said we need to update it. And actually what they did is they changed the bike plan. In the new bike plan, we got about 7 or 8 kilometers per year. In other words, it was about the same pace as before. What did happen and what did get the city moving towards more bike lanes was a global pandemic. And I always say that with obvious irony, because the fact that you need a global pandemic, you know, something that hasn't happened in 100 years, I mean, at that scale, that's what it took to get bike lanes. So in the pandemic year, and I mentioned, you know, our work to try to, you know, to get 120 groups to sign on, there were, of course, many others pushing for a cycling and walking infrastructure, pushing for space, more space for cyclists. The city did install that year 30 kilometers of bike lanes. This year, it's back down again to about 20, but it did take a global pandemic to move things forward. So right now we have about 210 kilometers of bike lanes. Remember, this is after 50 years, right? I took you back to the bicycle boom. After 50 years, we have 210 kilometers of on-street bikeways on a network, on a citywide road network that's 5,600 kilometers. So still pretty modest. So we did this bike lane report card. As I say, one of the things we've transitioned to doing is trying to push City Hall into accountability. In other words, accounting, not only saying, okay, well, we put in X number of bike lanes, but what's the quality and the utility of the bike lanes that you do have? And so I'll take you a bit through that, but essentially what we did, we evaluated, as your professors might, we evaluated every single bike lane, and we tried to do that in a comprehensive way. In other words, we had a template, a criteria that we were following. The first evaluator would go out and do the assessment, and then we'd have a second person review that first evaluation and to see whether the grade fit. So we had essentially a second set of eyes. And as a result of all that, we found that about 117 kilometers of the bikeways that we do have, and we're talking about on-street infrastructure, are poor or mediocre. And in other words, received a failing grade. Now, there was a question earlier about cycling infrastructure and whether the city knows what good cycling infrastructure is. I mean, the city knows how to build good cycling infrastructure. And part of the problem is that a lot of the infrastructure is simply outdated. Now, I mentioned earlier how a lot of the infrastructure comes from the 1990s. So by now it's out of date. It's either faded or simply the modern thinking around cycling infrastructure hasn't been applied. So let me just take you down then to what we did here. You heard about cycling infrastructure around York University. Looks fairly nice on paper, but what we did, one of the routes we evaluated, for example, so we in some cases, we didn't just look at a particular bike lane, but if there was a route, a discernible route that went from one place to another along a route, then we evaluated it together. So in this case, we looked at, called this a route Shoreham, then goes to the Pond Road and then down Sentinel, and then it ends up on a street called Dovehouse Avenue, which goes over to Keele Street, sort of, and you'll see that. So, there were some questions of, Ershon, what's a good bike lane look like? So here's some examples from, you might recognize these areas. So here's Sentinel Road, which is a bike lane. This is really sort of your very rudimentary kind of cycling infrastructure. And I should say that when I started cycling advocacy in about 2007, we would have been overjoyed to see a bike lane like this, because at the time we didn't have any bike lanes, and people were saying, I was mostly involved in advocacy on Bloor Street. We thought, wow, like we don't have anything. If we had just a painted road, a painted line, we'd be quite happy. But of course, That's some years ago, and now the thinking and the science has improved quite a bit. So here's Sentinel Road looking northbound towards the Pond Road. You obviously have public service here, the post truck sitting in the bike lane. So the problem with bike lanes like this, obviously it's a 4-lane road, so the speeds are going to be a lot faster than the posted speed of 40 kilometers per hour. And you also have these obvious intrusions all the time into the bike lane. So there has to be some enforcement if you don't have a proper separation. So here's the other obvious problem with Sentinel. I mean, it's one of those things you just scratch your head. I mean, the bike lane just ends. There's no sign or anything like that. There might be a sign that says bike lane ends before, but it ends at Assiniboine, and there's no sign, there's no apology. And in fact, where you need the bike lane most is at the intersection, but it ends. So there's a second sort of obvious deficiency in that bike lane. The part I like too is that at the Pond Road, well, if I'm a cyclist, I'm probably going to be more attracted to going right at the Pond Road instead of going left if I'm going northbound, because if I go right, then I get to all these beautiful buildings. I might get to my class. I can get to the new subway station. But here, there's no bike lane. There are just these sharrows, which we wouldn't call infrastructure. And I'm not sure what value this sign has, but it says share the road, which is, of course, an obligation on every road in the province. But the bike lane does go left. And it sort of takes cyclists away from where they really want to be. I mean, here you have the sign, wildlife crossing, and it's not a particular appealing place to be because there's nothing there unless I want to have a picnic. But if I'm going somewhere, it's not a nice route either. It's a very narrow bike lane, but it's also taking me away from the university. So I'd say in terms of its usefulness, I'd rather not be here. I'd rather be going through the university. Parts of it, and I mentioned the city does know how to build good bike lanes. Here you have an example of, there's just, there are at least flexi posts or bollards. There's a spatial buffer. So I feel a bit more comfortable cycling there. But when the motorists need the space again, then my rights as a cyclist or my interests for safety as a cyclist disappear again. So you see here the bike lane ends, it becomes sharrows. Why? Because the motorist wants to turn right here. And you see the sign here, bike lane ends. First it's sort of painted, but then it becomes very narrow. And that's a very awkward position for cyclists to be between right turning lanes and between through cars. I'd rather not be there, and it's not a pleasant place to be. Looking back, you'll see here how narrow that area is, but how the priority is obviously for people turning right and perhaps going to the parking lot. And here's another obvious one. This is just kind of this sort of adding insult to injury. So not only is it the bike lane sign ends after this pole, and I think that's probably a permanent sign. That's perhaps where the bike, I don't recall if the bike lane actually goes to Norfinch, but in any case, so not only do they, not give me any warning or any option or give me any other guidance, they put this big pipe, a cement barrier there right in the way. And this is so common across Toronto, very common. You have lots of construction sites all across Toronto. Often there's no provision for pedestrians, no provision for cyclists. Here's another at the other end. I mentioned Dove House. You know where you want the bike lane is usually at the intersection. It's the most important place to have it, but that's exactly where the bike lane ends. And so these signs are ubiquitous across the city. It just ends. There's no apology. And of course, it doesn't guide me across the road here where I might want to go. There's a nice little path across the road, or I might want to cycle on Keele. It doesn't give me that option. So here's simply a list of some of the deficiencies that we noted in our report. And I mentioned that 56% were judged either mediocre or poor. And we're trying to be generous. In fact, we didn't want to, we wanted to be credible. So we were generous in our grading. And then what we do want to use this report for, we don't, we want advocates to have this information. So we went to every single bike lane all across the city and we evaluated them. So this first of all, should be a very useful advocacy tool for advocates to say, look, here's where we were. Here's a snapshot in time in October 2020, and that's when we did the evaluations over a 7-week period. Here's the status of your bike lanes. What are they going to look like in a year from now? How much improvement have you made? And what we recommended, also using this as an advocacy tool, is put more funding, a new source of dedicated funding into upgrading bike lanes. I mean, if your TV is mediocre or your internet connection is mediocre or poor, it's usually not a safety issue. But if your bike lane is poor or mediocre, then it is a safety issue. And so these things should be brought up to date more quickly than at this current incremental pace that's happening now. The city is talking about, at least they're saying, we're proposing 30 kilometers for next year, but we know from long experience that what's proposed doesn't mean that will actually be implemented. And that's why it's so important for advocates, Airshun and others at York University and across the city to continue their advocacy. So in terms of dangers and opportunities, well, in terms of how we allocate space, we promote driving, and we know that 36% of Toronto's greenhouse gas emissions are from driving. Yet the city has this policy, they want to get 75% of all trips under 5 kilometers to be on foot, bikes, and transit. The new date is by 2030. The other opportunities are, of course, in electric bikes that really extends the range of bicycles dramatically. I see here in the area where I live, in terms of deliveries, there's a lot of food delivery by electric bikes, and a lot more can be done by electric bikes. So I'll end around here. Just a quick question in terms of talking about opportunities and risks, and looking forward to questions. So here's a title from the Globe and Mail: Climate Change Called One of Mankind's Biggest Challenges. Does anyone know what date that is from? So it's not from last month when we had, we're hearing about the atmospheric river in British Columbia, or earlier months hearing about the heat dome. This was in July 1988. That's when we had the first global conference on climate change. And one of the issues and why I'm so passionate about cycling is that, we absolutely have to get cars, we have to deal with the problem that we have far too many cars on our roads. And part of the reason for that is we allocate so much space to cars. So, people aren't born motorists or cyclists or pedestrians or transit users. They'll respond to the conditions. And right now the conditions say, drive your car or drive your pickup, drive whatever car you want, because that trip is an essential trip. But if we're going to deal with the climate crisis, we have to deal with well, here's the fight around Bloor. It was not an easy fight. Here's one of the rides that we did. So you see the kind of effort it takes in Toronto, no matter where you live, to get a simple bike lane, even in the most densely populated areas of the city. It's been a real challenge, but that's of course the fight that we're continuing now. So I'll end with that, and I'll look forward to any questions that people have.